Welcome. My name is Chandra Dasa from the Buddhist Centre Online team. And this is week 4 of our 6-part series with Paramanda and friends, having conversations about sources of inspiration, which has been a lovely project to be involved with so far. Nice to be back after a week off for Triratna Day last weekend. I'm very happy to welcome my friend Paramanda and also my friend Vadika from, he's from England, but he's been in Estonia, in Tallinn in Estonia for quite a while. Most of you, I'm sure, know who Vadika is. For anyone who doesn't, or for anyone watching this afterwards or listening afterwards, Vadika is the author of a magnificent book, which I really love personally, called The Buddha on Wall Street: What's Wrong with Capitalism and What We Can Do About It. There you go, Deanne's giving a thumbs up for that. And I'll paste some links into the chat to the book itself and also to an excellent series of podcasts that we collaborated on a couple of years ago now with Vadika about the Buddha on Wall Street. Really worth listening to, really worth reading if you haven't. Vadika's got a very interesting biography, some of which will come out, I'm sure. For the first 25 years of his life, his adult life, he was heavily involved in left-wing political activity, mainly around trade unions and in universities, adult education, around industrial relations and economics. And for the second 25 years of his life, or adult life, plus even, Vadika's been working as a full-time Dharma fairer, first in the UK and then in Estonia, where he's a teacher, organizer, just general exemplar of the best of the Dharma. He describes himself, it says here, as a free-thinking socialist and Buddhist, steeped in a thoroughly rationalist approach to life, but pulled by some inexplicable other in unexpected directions, which sets up the conversation pretty well, doesn't it? That's exciting. So I'm sure he's going to explore that with Paramanda. I'll hand you over to their good offices together, and let's give them a silent round of applause as they take the stage. So over to you, Paramanda.
Okay, thank you, Chandasa. Yes, so today I'm speaking to Vadika. I should say I don't really know Vadika very well. I don't think I've ever actually met him in person. We've had some contact over the internet, partly because I was due to do a retreat in Estonia last year and ended up doing it online. But the reason I wanted to talk to him was that a few years ago, a friend of mine sent me a link and said, "Oh, I think you'll be interested in this." And it was a video of Vadika giving a talk, I think at an Ordo convention, but I'm not sure. And I immediately felt, well, both intrigued by what he had to say, but also quite a strong resonance, because not partly because of what he said, but also something about his demeanor, about him as a person, and the background that he's come from, and his interests in politics, his being politically active for much of his life, and his interest in economics. And also what came through very strongly in this talk that I watched was there was this sort of pragmatism, but there was also this, well, I don't know if I should call it idealism. But it was obviously a man that was very moved by the Dharma, very moved, I think, also by poetry, and very concerned with both the kind of political in the broadest sense of that word and the economic, again in the broadest sense of that impact that Buddhism could possibly have on Western culture. And this resonated very much with me, and I felt and do still feel that these areas are also necessarily need translating. Our founder, Sangharakshita, in a way, was a translator of the Dharma, trying to make it relevant for the West. And I think Vardaka is also someone engaged in that project, as in a way we all are as members of the order. Anyway, so I'm really excited to have Vardaka here today. So welcome, Vardaka. And I'm going to ask him, he's brought along a poem, I think it is, to kick us off. So I'm going to ask him to kick us off with that, and we'll see what unfolds from there.
Thank you, Paramananda. Just a little bit of context to the poem that I'm going to read. When I first came into contact with Buddhism and with Triratna, I knew very, very little about Buddhism. I knew nothing about the theories, the terminology, that sort of thing. But what happened was, at that time, I was driving a lot all around England on the motorways. I was doing some research for the Firefighters Union. So I was visiting fire stations in different parts of England. And whilst I was driving, I was listening to cassette tapes with Sangharakshita speaking. And some things came through to me from those cassette tapes. And in the talk that Paramananda was mentioning, I said that on reflection, looking back, there were three particular aspects of Sangharakshita's vision of enlightenment that caught me at the time. And the first element in that vision that caught me was enlightenment as a sense of the unfolding of human potential. I was really excited that Sangharakshita talked about enlightenment as a next step in evolution of humanity. And that penetrated through and caught my attention and brought me into a deeper involvement with Buddhism. And the poem that I've chosen that I think captures this sense of the unfolding of human potential is a poem by the Swedish poet Thomas Tranströmer. It's called Romanesque Arches, and it's translated into English by Robert Bly. So this is the poem, Romanesque Arches. Tourists have crowded into the half-dark of the enormous Romanesque church. Vault opening behind vault and no perspective. A few candle flames flickered. An angel whose face I couldn't see embraced me, and his whisper went all through my body. Don't be ashamed to be a human being. Be proud. Inside you, one vault after another opens endlessly. You'll never be complete, and that's as it should be. Tears blinded me as we were herded out into the fiercely sunlit piazza, together with Mr. and Mrs. Jones, Herr Tanaka, and Signora Sabatini. Within each of them, vault after vault opened endlessly.
Thank you. That's a fantastic poem.
for me, it captures something about the nature of enlightenment, which I think in some ways is not an orthodox understanding of enlightenment, but that it represents a continuing unfolding and developing, that it's not an end point, that there's always something there. And it's incredibly hopeful, I think, about the nature of humanity, that there is something there within us that has great potential for development into who knows what.
I'm wondering, I'd be quite interested to know how, well, perhaps I can frame this just a little bit why I want to ask this question, because when I was about 14, I think, 13, 14, I don't know how old I was, I found in my school library a book on, I can still remember the cover, I can still remember the author actually, unlikely name of Arnold Kettle. And the book was called What Marx Really Said. And I read this book mainly because Karl Marx looked like a rather interesting character, you know, big bushy beard and stuff. And I remember it had a huge impression on me. It had a huge effect on me. I didn't become a Marxist. It wasn't so much, but I felt something open in me actually. So that poem reminds me. I felt something open in me, and what it made me realize that there was a different way of looking at the world than the one I'd been brought up and conditioned to by. You know, there was just a different way of interpreting human history, a different way of looking at human beings. So I'm saying this because I wonder if there is a connection for you from the political to the spiritual, that in a way that they're not discontinuous, if you see what I mean.
No, I think you're right. I remember before I became directly involved in politics that I had this very strong sense of idealism and a belief in the good that was there in the potential for humanity, that was something there in humanity. And I remember I was, even when I was deeply involved in the purely rational approach of economics, that there was something more beyond that. And when I got involved in socialism and started to read, it wasn't actually directly the writings of Karl Marx that caught me. It was the writings of others who maybe were in some respects inspired by Karl Marx or even preceded Karl Marx. So I think of myself, if I think of myself as a socialist, I think of myself as a socialist within a peculiarly British tradition of socialism, which has a sort of free thinking, freewheeling approach. And I think you can pick up on some bits of that from Karl Marx, but the problem is that over the years, since Marx wrote Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, that things have become narrowed down so that there's no longer that sort of free thinking, open searching aspect to it. And I've always had this conflict in my mind between having to belong to an organization to be able to further what I believe in and feeling restricted by the dominant beliefs or dogma or ideology of that group. So if you like, I'm a free-thinking socialist. I'm a free-thinking Marxist. There's something of an idealist there in Marx. But what's interesting is, if you search Karl Marx and look for descriptions of the kind of society that he envisaged once socialism came into being, there's hardly anything there. There's hardly anything there. And I think that I picked up that sense of potential from other writers and activists over the years, and maybe just developed it myself. So I think there is something exciting about Karl Marx. So, I mean, one of the really interesting modern Marxists is a man called David Harvey. He's very old now, but he has developed different ideas on the basis of what Marx wrote. And this is one of the problems, isn't it? That you have a great teacher and everybody gets stuck on exactly what the great teacher wrote in the past, and they're reluctant to challenge or develop beyond that. And that's a tension that I feel very strongly.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting what you say. I've been recently re-listening to that World Turned Upside Down.
Yes.
It's all the diggers, isn't it? And
yes.
Place, and that you get that real sense of that tradition running through through a lot of English history, don't you?
Yeah.
That socialist tradition, people wanting some. Well, as you said, people wanting to realise their potential in a way, isn't it? Realise their humanity, really.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about that tradition is that it's I called it, if you like, an English or a British sort of tradition of socialism, but it actually is a tradition that is richly based in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. There's all sorts of different elements feed through from those 4 different countries into a tradition of socialism. And I've always been attracted to the people within that tradition who are what I call free thinkers, people who will not be limited by one view, by an organization. And even if they belong to it, that you feel that resistance there and that desire to explore and to express. And something that came through to me from Sangharakshita, from what I picked up from the young Sangharakshita and the Sangharakshita starting out giving talks in England in the 1960s and 1970s, is that openness, challenging traditional ways of doing things. He was, in his own way, he was a free thinker. He was developing and translating in his own way. And my heroes have tended to be people like that, who, I remember going to an exhibition with Ratna Prabha, who I think Paramananda, from the West London Buddhist Centre. One of the times I was visiting England a few years ago, and he took me to an exhibition about William Morris.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and people think of William Morris in terms of wallpaper design and so on. But of course, he was a living example of a free-thinking socialist. And it's that kind of tradition, I think, blends well with my particular approach to Buddhism, which is to be very strongly influenced by the teachings, very strongly influenced by teachers, but to try and to be open to what is happening in the world and to develop one's own particular perspective within that.
So I'm wondering how you ended up in Estonia and how that sort of process of translation is going out there for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, when I think about how I ended up in Estonia, there is a very straightforward explanation and a deeper explanation. The straightforward explanation is that I had been living at Padmaloka Retreat Center for Men for over 6 years and had decided that I wanted to teach and be involved at an urban center, and I was going to move to the Birmingham Buddhist Center. And I had a 3-month gap between leaving Padmaloka and going to Birmingham. And at the time, Sadaloka lived at Padmaloka, and Sadaloka had been visiting Helsinki in Finland, St. Petersburg in Russia, and Tallinn in Estonia since the early 1990s. And they had just been gifted a center in Tallinn from a friend that bought a building that they could use as a center, but they didn't have an order member. So there were a few of us who went over as visiting order members. Shraddha Gita, I know, who is listening today, was one of those, and I was another. Osada, who's in Ireland now, was another. And that kind of visiting order member thing went on for 18 months or so, but they realized they really needed a permanently based or a longer term order member. And I was asked eventually if I would go there for a year, maybe 2 years, to help out. And I've now been there 16 years. Now, to my extreme embarrassment, you asked about translation. The thing is, I can't speak Estonian. It's an incredibly difficult language to learn. It has, I think it's 16 different case endings. 16 different case endings with a lot of irregularities and so on. That isn't really an excuse. I think I do have an excuse, which is that I like to work flat out on the Dharma, writing talks and so on, and to learn a new language, especially to learn Estonian, which is reckoned to be probably one of the most obscure and most difficult languages for English-speaking people to learn, I would have had to take a year or two out and immerse myself in Estonian culture, and not just learning the language, but immerse myself in Estonian culture and not do so much or do very little in terms of the Dharma. The other problem is in Tallinn is everybody speaks English. And they don't just speak English, they speak extraordinarily good English. And I speak something in Estonian to them and they know immediately I'm English. And then they start this conversation in English. But what it has brought home to me is this whole business of how you translate, because in Estonia, Buddhism only really arrived in modern times with the demise of the Soviet Union, the late 1980s, early 1990s. 1991 is when Estonia declared independence from the Soviet Union. And so you've had situations where the very few academic and serious Buddhists have had to work out a terminology in Estonian for Buddhism. And they built this on the basis of the work of one man, particularly a man called Lennart Mell. This is an extraordinary story. During the Soviet period, he was already, I think, a convinced Buddhist. He was a teacher at Tartu University, the main university in Estonia. But of course, the Soviet authorities didn't look kindly on him promoting Buddhism. And but he found a way around this. What he did was he did translations of key Buddhist texts. So some of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras from the Mahayana, from hundreds of years after the death of the Buddha. He translated the Dhammapada the words of the Buddha, phrases by the Buddha. And what he did was, and he translated the Diamond Sutra. So he presents these translations, and then in order to get them past the Soviet censors based in Estonia, he would then add to it a communist critique of the writing that he just translated in order to get it published. And it's well known now when you look back that the Soviet translators in Estonia, the guardians of the Soviet ideology, were more liberal than the rest of the Soviet Union. So he got away with it. He got away with it. So there's this foundation of translations, but there's still now, we're still working out terminology for words that are taken for granted in English. And it's a very creative discussion. But there's a deeper problem within it as well, which is that you simply don't have Estonian words or phrases for certain things that you find in Buddhism. So people have to really work and invent things. And this, of course, has been something that has affected Buddhism down the ages as it's moved from one culture or country to another, that there is this development, a creative development that takes place. And it's still going on here in Estonia. And this is the thing, I mean, I don't know if you don't mind, I'd just like to mention a writer who writes about translation that I find really interesting, because he brings some of the really interesting things about translation out. It's a man called Alberto Manguel. He's an Argentinian writer, and one of my all-time favorite books is by him. It's called A History of Reading. And there is a chapter in that book called The Translator as Reader. And Manguel starts this book sitting at a window in a cafe. He starts this discussion about translation, sitting at a window in a cafe in Paris. And he says, at this very place, at this very window, sat Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, when he was the secretary to Rodin, the sculptor, whose house was across the way. And there he worked on translating the poems of a French woman from the 16th century called Louise l'Abeille, sonnets, love sonnets. And he worked on translating these sonnets and published them. When he published them, one critic said, "This is really bad because he has improved the poems. You're not supposed to do that when you translate them. He made them better." But Manguel writes, it's not so much that he made them better. He put them into words and phrases in German that were simply not accessible in French. So Manguel says that he's sitting there in this window, looking out from the same position as Rilke at Rodin's house, with both Louise l'Abeille's French original sonnets in front of him and Rilke's German translated sonnets there. And he says, the reader, I am that reader, sitting at my cafe table with the French and German poems open in front of me. And I must apprehend those words intimately, no longer through any explicatory language, but as an overwhelming, immediate, wordless experience that both recreates and redefines the world. And he talks about then there are meanings, but there are no words for what he was experiencing, since these meanings exist in the intuitive no man's land between the language of the original and the language of the translator. And I just found that incredibly moving. And something that's caught there as well is a sense of something transcendental, something beyond what we might experience physically or what we can experience with a rational mind. It's when we read a really good poem, you don't have to analyze the poem. Something is communicated through directly, beyond words, I think.
And what is how would you connect this with, if we go back to what you were saying about enlightenment, this continuous unfolding?
Yeah.
Is that the feeling of an unfolding, do you think?
No, I mean, I think there's another aspect that was coming through to me from Sangharakshita's presentation of enlightenment. And I give it this description of enlightenment as a calling. And what I mean by that is that there's something there that calls to me, something transcendental that calls to me and pulls me, even if I'm not fully aware of it. So I think that's what Alberto Manguel was getting at when he talked about this wordless experience, that there's a sense of something more, something higher that is pulling me on. And I think about my life, that I make these changes in my life. And when I look back, they make, how did that happen? And I have this sense that something has been pulling at me, something way beyond my sort of rational, materialistic, economic background, which was trying to knock on the door, getting me to open the door to this mysterious beyond, something transcendental. And that relates to another poem, actually, which I think captures this sense of being pulled or called by something beyond. So is it okay if I read another poem?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
This is actually by Rilke. This is by Rilke, and it's called A Walk. And again, it's translated into English by Robert Bly. It's called Spaziergang in German, I think. And it captures for me what I mean by enlightenment as a calling, being pulled by something beyond my normal rational mind. So this is Rainer Maria Rilke's poem, A Walk. My eyes already touch the sunny hill, going far ahead of the road I have begun. So we are grasped by what we cannot grasp. It has inner light, even from a distance, and changes us, even if we do not reach it, into something else, which hardly sensing it, we already are. A gesture waves us on, answering our own wave, but what we feel is the wind in our faces.
I find that so interesting because the this idea of calling is quite interesting because it's in that poem, it's also unveiling of something that you already are, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet it's a calling, but so in a sense, it's a calling into yourself, is it?
Yeah, it's a calling to what I was talking about earlier, that human potential within us. there's a reverberation between the calling and something that is there waiting to unfold and open.
So this is maybe a bit of a tricky question, I don't know. But I'm really interested in what's the relationship between that calling and a collective transformation. Is it that everybody has to have that calling individually, or, well, I'll just leave it there. Do you understand what I'm asking there?
Yeah, okay. I'll try and give you my thoughts on it. I'm not quite sure whether it's a response to what you're saying or not, but again, what you're pointing to is something that was a very big tension for me when I was involved in, if you like, predominantly collective action. When I was a left-wing revolutionary, trade unionist, and so on. And the emphasis was very much on the collective. And the way to do things, to change the world, was by the collective. And when you look at the history of the attempts to impose communism on people in the Soviet Union, in China, and so on, there's a very, very strong emphasis on the collective and a suppression of the individual. The individual is not allowed to freely develop, to freely express themselves. And in fact, that was seen as a sort of a bourgeois deviation, something to be jumped on very strongly. And my view is now, when I think about that tension between the collective and the individual, in my mind, I come back to a teaching given by the Buddha in the Pali Canon, the early teachings of Buddhism, where he's talking about this person called the wheel-turning monarch, a great monarch. And they're called the wheel-turning monarch because a sign of the justness of their rule and their ability to impose stability and peace for all their people is the appearance of this wheel-turning gem. And the Buddha talks about the conditions that go to make up this just rule. And he gives a list of various conditions, including looking after the poor. I mean, there's a variety of conditions there. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the thing for me is that what comes across in that teaching and in all the way through the early teachings of the Buddha is that there is this symbiosis between the great ruler and the Buddha, the bringer of enlightenment, the teacher of enlightenment. And it's as if the function of the great ruler is to help to create the conditions in which individuals can develop by themselves, can develop to the full their human potential. So there's a very delicate balance to be drawn there, isn't there, between the collective and the individual? But the function of government, if you like, is to help to create the conditions in which individuals can develop to the fullest of their human potential.
Yeah, you get that reflected in the sort of Grail legend, don't you? Where the king is no longer blessing the land, that the land is going to waste, isn't it? The king's function is to bless the land, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, the positive king. And do you hold out hope for Buddhism as a blessing for the modern world? I mean, how?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Actually, I mean, maybe if I could answer that by bringing in a bit the third element in what I found in Sangharakshita's presentation of enlightenment that really caught me. which was, I describe it as enlightenment as a dynamic creativity. The Sangha Raishita described for me a sense of enlightenment as an always developing creativity. I mean, so he had this, this famous phrase like, enlightenment is not a spiritual retirement home. It's not like you reach enlightenment and that is it. There's this image, isn't it, of you're standing on the seashore and in the distance you can see the horizon. When you get to that horizon, another horizon opens up and so on. And that image of a dynamic creativity is really important to me. And I think that we're at a stage in the world today where, I don't know if people are familiar with this idea of the axial age. So the idea is that between about 600 or 700 BCE and it through to about 200 CE in the current era, there arose, the idea was put over by Karl Jaspers, a German existentialist and historian. There arose thinkers, individuals, and religious spiritual traditions in China, in India, and in the Greek philosophers and so on, with a very, very different view of what was needed for humanity to be able to develop. And I have this sense that we're at a stage now where the world needs or is beginning to go through a new axial age. And Buddhism, I don't think has all the answers to it, to what is needed, but I do feel that Buddhism can play a really important part in the development of a new world view that will allow humanity, first of all, to survive, which is not a foregone conclusion, I don't think, but to allow humanity to survive and to develop to the fullest of its potential to unlimited future horizons. And it probably, I think, in my view, it needs a dialogue, an interaction with other spiritual traditions, maybe secular ideas and so on, between Buddhism and various other things. So I think, for example, I find it interesting that the modern Stoics develop ideas in some ways that have a lot of resonance with Buddhism. At the same time, there's ideas there within Buddhism about the mystery of enlightenment and the beyond and so on, that have a resonance with Christian and Sufi mystics and so on. There's a need for, I think, for a sort of new melting pot, if you like, where new ideas and approaches can emerge. Because what is clear, isn't it, from Buddhism, is that whatever is done collectively to provide conditions for stability, that by itself will not be enough unless there is a transformation in individual human consciousness. If there is not that transformation, things can always fall backwards. So I don't know if that gives you an idea of some of my thinking on it. Yeah.
Well, it does, yeah, definitely. But I mean, the other thing, of course, about Buddhism is always emphasized community, hasn't it? So it has got, although in a sense, the development's individual, but it's always done in relationship to others, or usually done it in, that is one of the jewels, isn't it? Sangha, community. I mean, that's interesting enough, of course, that's the other thing that Sangharakshita was very strong on, wasn't he? He was very strong on the need to create Sangha.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Sangha is a community of individuals.
Of individuals, yes.
Yeah, it's a community of individuals. And I think that that is really important, that that people we're going to get lots of individual differences and expressions
mm, mm,
of what Buddhism means to us, what is needed in the world, and so on. And that individuality, that development of strong individuals needs to be seen as being, the Sangha gives support to that and allows individuals to develop, to feel that there is a space in which they can debate with each other and develop as individuals. So I've always been interested. A long time ago, there was this book published by Reginald Ray called
wow,
Buddhist Saints in India, where
yeah,
he was looking back at the development of Buddhism, and he had this threefold model of what kept Buddhism together. And so you had the lay people, you had the settled monastics, and they were in this sort of symbiotic relationship of support from the lay people for the settled monastics, who gave teachings and kept the texts and everything. But the third set of people were the forest renunciants, the people who went off into the forest, to the wilderness,
mm,
who were individuals who probably gave radically uncomfortable teachings and would throw these little bombs, if you like, into the world of the monastic Sangha, saying, what about this? What about that? And so on. And I think the idea of individuals as forest renunciants being very important, people, strong individuals, prepared to rock the boat in some ways. Going back to what I said earlier on, which I'm really attracted by, is this idea of free thinkers.
mm, mm, mm.
They're supported within the Sangha. They need the Sangha for an environment to stimulate them and so on, but they need to be completely free in their thinking.
I suppose the other thing I find self thinking while we're talking is how also we need to be in relationship, don't we, to practice in a sense, to practice kindness and love in a way.
Yes.
I feel I want to bring love into this somehow. It seems a vital ingredient to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's got to be there. I mean, you get that impression, don't you, that somehow that, you've talked a bit about what, the dreadful history of communism in Russia and China, and somehow love went, didn't it?
Yes.
And it was replaced by cruelty, wasn't it? Somehow,
Yeah.
This willingness to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
The individual, to be Kantian about it. The individual is no longer ending his or herself, was it?
Yeah. Yeah.
The individual got lost, didn't it? And this
Yeah.
this need to, but it's difficult, isn't it? That tension that one has to maintain, that you probably do need the monastics as well as the forest dwellers or whatever we call them. Yeah, there's this sort of tension that needs to be there, doesn't there? There needs to be some organizational principles there. But also needs to be, as you say, the openness and the willingness for that to be questioned continuously in a way.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right that it's, I can't remember, there were these several things that Sangharakshita did. It was a sort of a variation. It was a five-fold path of various things, and the last one was basically be kind to others. The most important thing, be kind to others. And if you can't be kind to others, if you can't love others, then everything that I've said doesn't work. It doesn't work. Without kindness and love, it doesn't work. Fundamental human value. If you want to relate to others, you need to be kind, you need to love, you need to imagine what it's like to be the other, and to be kind, and to have empathy for what it's like to be the other, to see suffering and respond with compassion. In a way, that's the most important sort of political message one could put over in the world today, isn't it? To respond to suffering with kindness and compassion.
It takes a long time in a way to learn.
Yes.
I mean, it seems so obvious, doesn't it? But I know one of the things I found about getting older is, just appreciating more and more the importance of simple kindness, really.
Yeah.
Maybe you become more, you're more, as you get more in touch with your own vulnerability. I don't know what it is, but there's kind of an opening, isn't there?
Yeah. And the conclusion I've come to is there are no shortcuts to creating the ideal kind of society. You can't enforce or impose.
No.
People have to be allowed to develop themselves. And the sense of kindness. I mean, you mentioned age there as you get older. I mean, one of the things that I've become much more aware of course, is the impermanence of the body, and how life can slip through so easily. Maybe I wonder if you'll indulge me and just let me read a short extract from a poem by Robert Burns, Tam O'Shanter. I came across this. I was reading the last book written by Clive James, The Fire of Joy, and Feu de Joie, and in it he has Tam O'Shanter, and he picked out a few words in his commentary on it, and I read the poem, and these few words really cut through to me. I was saying earlier that poetry can cut through in a way that other teachings can't, and this is the words by Robert Burns. But pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed. Or like the snow falls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. Or like the borealis race that flit ere you can point their place. Or like the rainbow's lovely form, evanishing amid the storm. I've never heard that word, evanishing. It doesn't exist in the dictionary, but it captures, doesn't it? What a rainbow does and what happens. It's a wonderful set of words. Yeah. Maybe that's a good point to draw things to a close. I'm looking at Chandradasa. I'm not wondering if that's
Any way of it.
Well, I think we've got 1 minute.
You've got 1 minute. You've got 1 minute left, but you can meander towards the end. I'm sure if anybody needs to leave, they can leave. That's fine.
But that's and the Clive James wrote that book as he was dying.
Yes.
Put it together. That was his last task in life, to put together that book. And what a wonderful gift of kindness to everybody to leave that book.
He had quite a protracted dying, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He wrote a poem about the imminence of dying about 6 or 7 years before. And we're saying that people must be getting impatient with me now.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and being the guest there, and it's been lovely to speak to you actually, and to hear what you have to say. Yeah,
Thank
I,
you,
I hope
Paramanda.
I hope I do get out to Estonia sometime.
Yes, so do I. You will do, I'm sure. You will do. We'll manage it.
Yeah,
Good.
good.
So, and thank you, Chandra Dasa, for hosting this.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. Thanks to you both. That was a really great conversation. I could easily listen for another hour at least. So maybe if we're going to do a season 2, Paramanda, we need to invite Vatican back.
Yeah,
So you can just go further and deeper into that territory. Thanks to you, Valika, for taking the time. And thanks to all of you who attended. There's another 2 weeks of this series left. If you haven't found it yet, you can go to the Eventbrite page via thebuddhistcenter.com/live, which I'll put the link in the what should we call it? The box, the chat box, and you can go. If you register for this, we'll be sending out some emails with all the links that have appeared through the course of the event, so that you can go and do your own research on the conversations. As ever, if you can afford to support us, please do. It's a relatively niche area to put on Buddhist cultural events, we find, but it's so valuable. And of course, there's quite a lot of work goes in behind the scenes. So if you're able to support the ongoing curation of events like this, please do. The link's in the chat. But yeah, please feel free just to unmute yourself to offer your own thanks to Vatican and Paramanda before we drift off into the ether for another week.
Good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. That was amazing. Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paramanda.
Yeah, thank you.
That was great.
Thanks for coming.
Dzień dobry.
Yeah, thanks very much. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye.